I'm 55 years old, and I still remember the first time I rolled a die. It was in 7th grade, in a classroom that smelled of chalk and old books. Someone opened a rule book, and the room changed. Suddenly, we weren't just kids, we were explorers. A world of monsters, treasure, and choices. I was fascinated. Not by dragons, but by the feeling that something real was happening. The years passed, school became college, and the game stayed with me. But my understanding changed. I started to see patterns, not in the fantasy world, but in our real life. The same structure, the same rules. And I realized this was never just a game. It was a training ground for uncertainty. Have you ever asked yourself, what shapes our lives? Is it our habits, our rules, or the choices we make without knowing the outcome? Most people believe life rewards certainty, plan, control, predict. But real life doesn't work like that. It's unpredictable. And the moment you accept that, you begin to understand something else. Uncertainty is not a flaw. It's the system. In the 1970s, the world was unstable. Cold War. The fear of consequences beyond control. People tried to simulate risk. War games. Systems where outcomes could be calculated. Until someone asked a different question. What if the world couldn't be predicted? What if uncertainty was the point? That question changed everything, and it gave birth to a game that would quietly train generations to live without guarantees and to make decisions when the outcome is unknown. That's the real lesson, and it began here. In the mid-1970s, two men sat at a table, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. They were not creating a fantasy story. They were creating a system, a set of rules with uncertainty built in. Not a fairy tale, a simulation, a controlled experiment in decision-making. Each choice had a cost, each role had a risk, and one person held the world. The dungeon master. Not a narrator, not a referee, a system operator. He controlled the world. The rules were his laws, the dice were the uncertainty, and the players were the decision makers. Every choice mattered, not because the world was real, but because the consequences were. The rules were a promise. If you follow them, the world responds. And when you break them, the world changes. This was not entertainment, it was training for a world where outcomes are unknown, a world where you must decide without knowing what comes next. And that was the power of Dungeons and Dragons. Not the dragons, not the treasure, the uncertainty. And the first generation of players learned it without knowing they were learning. I was part of that first generation, a boy who didn't know he was learning. I played as a character, and I also became the dungeon master. I had the world in my hands. The players looked to me for answers, and I realized something early. The game wasn't about winning. It was about facing uncertainty, because every decision had a cost. The group learned to negotiate, to compromise, to accept the results, and to live with them. Over the years, the game changed. New rules, new additions, different generations. But the core remained the same. Decisions in the dark. The DM became a mirror of life, because life also has a DM, not a single person, systems, institutions, rules. We live inside structures, and we make choices inside them. D&D trained me for that, not by teaching me rules, but by teaching me to accept uncertainty. Because in the game, you cannot predict everything, and neither can you in life. I remember a moment when I thought I knew the outcome, and I was wrong. That moment changed me, not because I lost, but because I realized you never truly control the outcome. You only control the decision to act, and that is what the game teaches. But the lesson becomes clear only later, when life forces you to roll your own dice, and you realize you were never playing alone. You were practicing for the real world. Let me tell you a story. It was one of my first campaigns as a dungeon master. The players were confident. We had reached a dangerous dungeon. Their characters were strong. They believed they could handle anything. I watched them, and I decided to test them. Not to punish them, but to show them something. The dungeon had a door. Behind it was a corridor. I told them, "You can go through, but you must decide carefully." They laughed. "We have high stats," they said. "We can handle it." So I let them proceed. They entered the corridor. The air grew colder. The players began to feel it. I rolled in secret. The result was not what they expected. And then it happened. The trap triggered. One character fell. Not just injured, dead. The room went silent. They looked at me confused. "Why?" they asked. I told them the truth. Because you assumed you were safe. You assumed the game would protect you. But the game doesn't protect anyone. It only reflects reality. The world doesn't owe you safety. You have to earn it. That was the lesson. And it was painful, but it was honest. They didn't forget that moment, and neither did I. Because life is full of traps, and you don't always know where they are. You can only decide and accept the outcome. That's what D&D taught me. Not how to win, but how to live. That night, I understood something. The game was not about adventure. It was about decisions, and about accepting uncertainty. In life, you rarely know the outcome. You plan, you prepare, you try to control what you can, and then something unexpected happens. A crisis, a loss, a moment that changes everything. The question is not, why me? The question is, what do I do now? That is the only thing you control. Not the outcome, but the decision. In D&D, you learn that. You learn to act without certainty, to accept the result, and to move on. That lesson follows you through careers, through relationships, through every moment of uncertainty. Because life is a series of roles. You never know what comes next, but you still choose. And that is courage. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act anyway. That is the real power of the game. It trains you for life, and it does it quietly, without speeches, without slogans, just a simple truth. You are not guaranteed safety, but you are guaranteed choice, and the world will respond. Now, let's talk about how this translates to real life. In business, we call it risk management. In D&D, you face uncertainty every turn. You don't know what the enemy will do. In business, you don't know the market. You don't know your competitors. You don't know the future. So you prepare for multiple outcomes. In the game, you have a plan, but you also have flexibility. You can pivot when reality changes, and that is the difference between winners and losers. The world is not a straight line. It's a path with twists. You learn to adapt, you learn to analyze, and you learn to move on. This applies to family life too. Children don't come with instructions. Neither does life. You have to make choices and accept consequences. In D&D, you can't rewind time. You live with your choices, and that is a rare lesson. Most people avoid it. They postpone decisions. They wait for certainty. But certainty rarely comes, and waiting costs you time. The game teaches you act anyway, even when you're unsure, even when the outcome is unknown, because action creates information, and information reduces uncertainty. Every role teaches you something, not just about success, but about learning to live. And that is why I keep playing, because the game reminds me of life. It teaches me to accept uncertainty and to make choices with courage, not because I am fearless, but because I know the rules of the world, and I know I can move forward even when the dice fall badly. The story begins in the 1970s, a time when games were simple, when a group of friends wanted more than just rules. They wanted a world. Fantasy was there, but not like we know it now. They wanted imagination to be the engine. So they built a new kind of game, a game where the story is not written, where the players write the story and the dungeon master guides it. Dungeons and Dragons was born. It was not just a game, it was a new format. Like a startup, they had a product but no market. So they created a community of storytellers. And it grew. Through the 80s, through controversies, when people misunderstood it, they thought it was dangerous, but it was just imagination. In the 90s, it evolved. New rules, new mechanics, and new audiences. Then came the internet, and the game spread like wildfire. People started sharing sessions, turning it into entertainment and a global culture. D&D is played everywhere, in schools, in therapy, in business, because it teaches something universal. It teaches collaboration, it teaches empathy, and it teaches leadership. The dungeon master is not a boss, he is a guide. And that is why it survives, because it reflects life, and because it gives people a safe place to practice being human and to try again. That is the magic. Not spells, not dragons, but the courage to choose and the freedom to write your story. You might think it's just a game, but it changes you. Not immediately. Not in a single session, but over time. You learn to listen, to hear others, to negotiate, to cooperate, and to support. You learn responsibility, to admit you were wrong, to encourage others. You learn courage, not the loud kind, the quiet, steady kind, the kind that keeps you moving, because you learn to accept failure and to continue anyway, even when it hurts, and to forgive, because the game is built on trust, on respect, and on shared stories. You create a character, and through them you practice life. You practice choices. You practice consequences. You practice identity, and you learn who you are. Because the game shows you your habits, your fears, your strengths, and it gives you a chance to change. That is the real gift, the chance to practice being better, to be kinder, to be wiser, to be braver, and to return. Because the table is a mirror. It reflects your choices and your growth and your courage. So when I think of that failure, I don't see shame. I see a lesson and a path forward. That is what D&D taught me, and that is why I keep playing. Let me tell you about a time when the game became real. It was my university years. I was studying, working, and still playing. Our group met every week, and I was the dungeon master. But that semester, I was also under pressure. Money, deadlines, expectations. I felt like I was losing control. Then the campaign started. One of the players made a bold plan. They wanted to attack a fortress, and I had to decide, help them or force them to face the consequences. I chose the second. I let them fail. The room went silent. One of them left the table. I felt responsible. I thought maybe I was too harsh. But then something happened. The player came back. Not because I changed the rules, but because they learned something. They said I needed to feel the consequences. And I realized I had done my job. Because the game is not about winning. It's about learning to live with your choices. That moment changed me. I stopped trying to control everything. I accepted uncertainty, and I started making decisions with more courage. Not because I stopped caring, but because I understood the difference between control and responsibility. Control is impossible. Responsibility is a choice. And that is the lesson D&D gave me. A safe place to practice being human, to practice choices, and to practice trust, and to practice courage. That's why I keep returning, because the table is not just wood and dice, it's a mirror, and sometimes it shows you who you can become. If you want to start, you don't need much. You don't need to be an expert. You just need a willingness to learn. The first step is character creation. You choose a class, a race, a story, and that's the first lesson. You create your own path. The second step is to find a group. Not necessarily gamers, just people who want to try. The best games happen with friends and with comfort. The third step is the dungeon master. The DM doesn't need to know everything. They need to guide, to ask questions, and to listen. The fourth step is to embrace uncertainty. Don't seek perfect answers. Seek learning. Every session teaches something, and the lessons are not only about the game, they apply to life. You learn planning, negotiation, conflict management, leadership, and empathy, and the courage to act. The game gives you a safe space to practice. You can fail, you can try again, and you can grow. So my advice is simple. Start small, find friends, learn together, and don't be afraid of uncertainty. Because life is uncertain too, and the only way to live it is to choose and to keep moving forward. The game is waiting. If you're curious, try it. You might be surprised what you learn. If you remember only one thing from this video, it is this. Life is a game of decisions, and every decision matters. Not because it guarantees success, but because it shapes who you become. D&D taught me that, and I hope it can teach you too. So if you ever feel lost, remember, you still have the choice, and you can choose again. That is the power of the game and the power of life. If you liked this story, subscribe to Business Chronicles, like this video, and hit the bell to not miss new stories. We have many more stories ahead. Next time, we will talk about how the rules of risk shape the world of business. Until then, keep rolling.